time check, like maybe every 20 minutes or so. I would greatly appreciate it. And and also if you could monitor the chat for me. With that said, welcome everyone. My name is Melody Sassas. This is part 2 of a 2-part presentation or series about immigration relief for survivors of interpersonal violence. We last talked about relief under the Violence Against Women Act and other types of relief available for certain abused immigrant spouses. And today we're going to focus on U visas, which is special non-immigrant status for survivors of certain qualifying criminal activities, and T visas. If we could just hold just a second. Yeah, thank you for muting. And T visas, which is for a type of non-immigrant status that is available for victims of severe forms of human trafficking. And I will help you understand what that means, what severe forms of human trafficking means in an instant. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And get us started. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Can just do a hand thumbs up. Good. Okay, thank you. All right, and let's get started. So before we jump in the presentation, today we're going to be talking about crimes, and we're going to spend a significant amount of time talking about trafficking. And I just wanted to take a step back and recognize that this country was built and founded on the exploitation and enslavement and trafficking of people. And so I wanted to express, I wanted to say a labor acknowledgement statement. And I found that this quote by Dr. T.J. Stewart is very illuminating and acts as a reminder to acknowledge that much of what we know of this country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development throughout history and across time, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their ascendants, who suffered the horror of the transatlantic trafficking of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. We are indebted to their labor and their sacrifice, and we must acknowledge the tremors of that violence throughout the generations and the resulting impact that can still be felt and witnessed today. And this is particularly true when we discuss immigration law, because we can see the continuation of the enslavement, kidnapping, and displacement of peoples, the exploitation, be it labor exploitation or commercial sexual exploitation of undocumented immigrants, the incarcerated, and those without states. And we also want to recognize that in conjunction with our land acknowledgement statement, that we are sitting on occupied land that was never ceded, that this country, and particularly California, was also built on the enslavement of indigenous peoples by Spanish missionaries. Okay, so moving on with what I hope you will get from this presentation. So after this presentation, I hope that you will be able to identify challenges and obstacles faced by immigrant survivors of crime, including trafficking. And you'll be able to explain the basics of the U visa, the T visa, and eligibility requirements, and continued presence. And continued presence is can be a critical tool to help potential witnesses in human trafficking investigations and prosecutions in getting temporary work authorization and temporary protection from removal. And we will discuss this in greater detail down the line. And then how to refer immigrant survivors to Baylegal. I know that we kind of skipped over that part during the last presentation, but hopefully we'll have time to cover it this time. So just a quick review. The next few slides are going to look familiar for those of you that attended part 1, but again, I have included a slide that has on the abbreviations that I use on my slides, so that it's kind of like a key, so you can look at the abbreviation and look what it stands for. And then I have I'm including the pyramid, right, that we had explored last time on who has the most protections, right? And just as a quick review, those who are undocumented, don't have any legal documentation to live and work here in the United States, and that it can be, that category includes people who have overstayed their visas or who entered the United States without inspection, admission, or any documentation. Right above that, we had people who may have deferred action, whether it's through temporary protected status or the Dreamers with DACA. And we learned that deferred action is not a legal status per se, but rather a designation that says the person is low priority for removal, and that they are authorized to work, but it's not a path to a green card, and thus not a path to eventually applying for US citizenship. And it can be the programs that allow for this type of work authorizations can be ended at any moment. Right above that, we had the category of non-immigrants. And so those are visas really for a specific purpose and a specific length of time. And today we're going to be focusing on 2 of such non-immigrant categories, the U visa and the T visa. And we also found out that some of them you could eventually be eligible to apply for a green card, and that's certainly going to be the case for U visas and T visas. But others, like a tourist visa, is not a pathway to a green card. We also learned about refugees, asylees, and VAWA applicants, that they can get legal status and the ability to work in the United States, and then be eligible to apply for a green card. And above that, we had the green card holders, which are the lawful permanent residents, and then that can work and live legally in the United States and can travel abroad with some restrictions, but they can't vote. And then above that, you have US citizens who have the who are either US citizens by birth or who have naturalized, meaning that they've met the eligibility requirements and have waited the amount of time that they needed to in order to be able to apply for their US citizenship. And naturalized US citizens can do pretty much anything that citizens by birth can get and can do, except be like the US president. But I will also say that, this is we're talking about immigration law, but obviously this pyramid exists in a context of where still today people who have been born in the United States don't always enjoy, right, all the rights and privileges of citizenship. I think that's especially true for BIPOC US citizens. I've included this slide again to just review briefly the bureaucracy of administering the immigration laws. Remember, this is a function that falls under the executive branch, so under the President of the United States. We talked about how the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, governs both the enforcement and the administration of the immigration laws, but that there were also other agencies and other departments that were that also in some ways interacted with the immigration law system. So I just want to go over quickly like which departments, right? So we talked about the Department of Homeland Security, who has as agencies has USCIS, U.S. Citizenship of Immigration Services, that and where they adjudicate affirmative applications for relief, including the U visa and T visa applications that we will be talking about. The Department of Homeland Security also, oversees ICE, which is Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, who enforce and detain, enforce the immigration laws and detained alleged violators of immigration law. And they also are the branch that represents the government in immigration court. And then you have Customs Border Patrol, so CBP, who is in charge of enforcing the immigration laws within 100 miles of the border. And then you have Homeland Security investigations, which focuses on transnational crimes, and are often involved in operations that against human traffickers. You have the Department of Labor, which can be of importance in the U visa and T visa context, because they are the ones that enforce wage and hour and labor complaints. And so they may play a critical role in the detection and identification of human trafficking. You have the Department of Justice, which oversees the Executive Office of Immigration Review, which is just a mouthful of words to say the immigration courts. So if people are put in deportation proceedings, which is now called removal proceedings, they will appear in immigration court, and the judge is actually part of the Executive Office of Immigration Review. But remember that the government attorney is from ICE. And so you can already see how the system is skewed when the fact finder and the decision maker is really falls under the same branch of the government as the attorney representing the government. And then you have the Department of Human and Health Services that oversees the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And so they'll be dealing with, uh, refugees, but also unaccompanied um, minors, so unaccompanied migrant children that come to the United States. And then you have the Department of State, which really is oversees the external affairs, right, of the United States, and that includes overseeing the U.S. consulates and embassies where uh, there are consular processing interviews for, let's say, derivatives who live abroad. And so that also plays a key role in U visas and T visa cases. And final, final review slide. Remember that all of these immigration reliefs that we talk about can vary, right? They can be used affirmatively. So you apply with United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. And some reliefs are available in immigration court as defensive relief, but some affirmative relief you can also use as a defensive relief in immigration court. These immigration reliefs exist within a broader context of other immigration relief. Lawyers like to joke that immigration law is the second most complicated area of law after tax law. And that's because there's so many different types of immigration relief, and they all have different eligibility requirements. They all vary in terms of what inadmissibility grounds you can waive, who can be included as derivatives, whether or not they're a path to a green card. And so it makes for a very complex area of law. But the importance is to remember that there are other types of immigration relief that may not be survivor specific, but that can also be important. And so that's why we always encourage undocumented immigrants particularly, but also like TPS holders and DACA holders to have like an annual screening by a trusted immigration attorney or immigration agency, so that because circumstances change, and so they may not be eligible for a type of relief when they first come to get a screening, but they may, things change and life happens, and so they may become eligible for immigration relief down the road. And then the types of reliefs that we're talking about that are survivor specific do vary in terms of like, do they make people eligible for public benefits? And if so, what sort of public benefits, like federal versus state? And then they also vary in terms of quantities that are issued per year and processing times. And that's going to be true. We'll explore the difference between the U visas and T visas. So before I move on, I wanted to think collectively, what are some obstacles and barriers that you see immigrant survivors, particularly immigrant survivors of crime and trafficking, face? And you can either shout it out or post it in the chat. What do you think are some barriers to getting access to legal services, for example, or other services?
I think just mistrust, not knowing who to trust anymore, having that fear.
Okay, and where can that mistrust come from?
I could only imagine sometimes when they do encounter these situations, they were already trusting somebody to help them out. And then so that could just Yeah, they were already trusting somebody. So how do they know who they could trust? And if they're putting themselves in danger or their children in danger, um, that creates that fear.
Yeah, so fear of getting deported, mistrust. Mistrust could be, they may have already experienced uh, uh, persecution or harassment, or have been abused or exploited in the past, and then they may fall into this new exploitative circumstance. Sometimes abusers also deliberately manipulate them and say, like, you don't have any rights here, and so there may also be just a lack of knowledge of their rights. um, Language barrier, trust and discrimination, job abuses, yes, language barriers, fear, um, financial instability, uh, law enforcement, I think access to schools, driving like that. I'm assuming, Karina, you're saying that driving, like they don't know how to drive, or they don't have access to a driver's license or mode of transportation. But feel free to speak up if that's not where you
Yeah,
were
no,
going.
I was thinking exactly that, of just some folks are afraid to get a driver's license because then they'll be in the system, or there's that huge anxiety around like just
Yes,
driving anywhere.
yes. And we all know that, in California, actually you can get an AB60 driver's license, but um, even that license has the language federal restrictions may apply. And so, obviously, um, that kind of outs people as perhaps not having, like being in the United States without like documentation. Wage theft, thank you. Lack of resources. Um, Conflicting state versus federal law, yes. Particularly around marijuana also. Um, okay, so all of those are great, um, great comments, and that is exactly, what what we'll be exploring. So before um, we go on, sorry, not go. Before we go on, I just wanted to give you a quick background on, uh, the what the U visas and T visas are. So, and some similarities. So they were both created with the passage of the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of 2000. And so the U visas are for victims of certain qualifying criminal activities, which we will explore what that means in this in a moment. And only 10,000 are issued per fiscal year. Each fiscal year starts October 1st. And then compare that to T visas, which are for victims of severe forms of human trafficking. Again, we will explore what that means in a moment. And they issue 5,000 per fiscal year. But it is underused compared to the U visa. And so with the U visa, there is a huge backlog because unfortunately, many immigrants are victims of the certain qualifying criminal activities. Um, Both the purpose of these visas was to help law enforcement in the detection, investigation, and or prosecution of these crimes, including human trafficking. It give temporary legal status and work authorization. Uh, Both can include derivatives, although who can be included varies and differs among the two. And they're both a path to a green card. So let's talk about the U visa. How many of you, if you can just use your like the raise your hands or emojis, how many of you have heard of the U visa? I'm trying to see. Yeah. Okay, Swastika, I see you. Okay, so I see a few thumbs up. Okay. Well, it also looks like many of you haven't heard of the U visa, so I will be talking about that, and it can be a very effective tool. So in order to be eligible for a U visa, you have to be a victim of a qualifying crime. Domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, slavery, all of those are considered qualifying crimes, but we will explore what that means in a moment as well. You have to show that you've suffered a substantial physical or mental abuse. And abuse here is really used as a synonym for harm, because of the victimization. That you also have to show that you have information about the crime, and that you have been, are likely to be helpful, or are being helpful in the detection, investigation, or prosecution of the crime. And you have to show that you're admissible or eligible for a waiver of inadmissibility. So let's break it down, okay? Because that's a lot of words, and it doesn't look like a lot of eligibility requirements, but actually there are some nuances here. So the first one I want to talk about is, what does victim mean? Victim can be like the direct victim. So if I am punched by someone, I am the direct victim of the battery, right? Because I received the punch. But victim can also include special types of direct victims that are called bystander witnesses, who witness the crime, and as a result of witnessing the crime, suffer such unusual and severe harm that it's almost as if they were the direct victim of the crime. So the example that USCIS likes to use, and I apologize for, saying traumatic things, but is, a pregnant woman sees her colleague being stabbed, and as a and the colleague dies, and as a result of this, she suffers from a miscarriage. I have used it in cases where an adult daughter who wouldn't be able to qualify as a derivative witnessed part of a physical attack on of her mom by her mom's boyfriend, who was not her father. And she suffered psychological harm, suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, etc. And then there's also a category of victims called indirect victims. And the most common scenario that we see is when you have a parent of a sexually abused child, who is not abused by the parent, but by someone else, who participates in the investigation and prosecution of the sexual abuse, and who suffers, again, substantial mental and psychological harm. So for that, you need like a specific type of familial relationship, and sometimes the ages are important. So the age of the victim is usually very important. If you're talking about a parent, the direct victim must be unmarried and under 21 years of age. so that they can qualify. All right, and so what does it mean to suffer substantial physical or mental abuse? So physical, I think, is pretty straightforward, right? It can be like bruises, it can be uh, swelling, injuries, like wounds, uh, and then mental can be uh, the all of the psychological harm, and it's usually helpful to have like a letter from a therapist or from a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but or even from advocates who can describe like the behavior of the victim, like is this person, you know, scared? Are there triggers? Um, for domestic violence survivors, you don't have to, um, let me rephrase that. For domestic violence survivors, you can, in their declaration, what I like to do is actually write about the history of domestic violence, including the incident that was reported to the police. But I also talk a lot about the unreported incidents. And the reason why I do that is because USCIS will consider a number of factors in determining what's substantial. So it could include the frequency and severity of the abuse. It could include, the impact. It can include how um, the reported incident uh, aggravated pre-existing trauma. And that could be trauma from like unreported incidents of domestic violence, but it could also be like trauma from perpetrated by other aggressors. Um, and there's not one single factor that they look at, and they can also look, you know, even if something, even if a particular incident, a series of incidents on their own don't seem to uh, be substantial, if they're looked at cumulatively, then they may rise to the level of substantial abuse. And so, for example, I had a case where the reported incident was a violation of a restraining order. And the violation was a violation of the no contact order and the stay over order. There was no incident of physical abuse as part of that restraining order violation, but I was able to show, by talking about the previous unreported history reviews, but also by showing what California law defines as disturbing the peace, that gave rise to this person's ability to get a restraining order in the first place. And then case law from California that shows that violations of restraining orders is abuse because it breaks the mental and emotional calm of the parties. I was able to show that there was substantial abuse coming from that reported incident. Now, how can the victim show that they have information about the crime, and how can they show that they are being or are likely to be helpful in the detection and investigation of the crime? They do that by uh, requesting from the law enforcement agency that um, uh, that they complete and sign this special form, which is the Form I-918 Supplement B certification, or UCERT for short, as we call it among immigration attorneys. And so this is the most important document after the person's declaration for a U visa application. Without a signed certification, you cannot apply for a U visa. And so once the certification is signed, then you have 6 months to complete the rest of your application and send it off to USCIS. Any questions so far?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I've been working with a few families. Okay, one, I've never heard of this, but I was told that if the abuser is also undocumented, then they wouldn't qualify. Is that true?
For a U visa?
For domestic violence. So
No. So I think if really the abuser status is going to be relevant only if you're contemplating Violence Against Women Act, like, the VAWA self-petition.
okay.
The I-751 waivers that we talked about, or the I-765V, that special work permit for certain non-immigrant visas. For the purpose of the U visa, it doesn't matter. The abuser status doesn't matter. What matters is if they're a victim of a certain qualifying crime, and you can obtain that certification from a law enforcement agency, or that can be like the police, the sheriff, the district attorney's office. In some counties, it can include like Children Protective Services. It may be, you may be able to, in some counties, also get like family law judges who issued the restraining order to sign the certifications. It can be like the criminal law judges. Any agency that has the power to detect or investigate or prosecute can sign off on that certification. But so for the U visa, you're going to be focusing to see if they meet the requirements, that they are a victim of a certain qualifying crime, that they suffer substantial harm, right? That they know about the crime, and that they are helpful, have been, or will be helpful, or are being helpful in the detection, investigation, or prosecution of that qualifying criminal activity, and that they're eligible, that they're admissible or eligible for a waiver of inadmissibility. Now, the beauty of the U visa is actually that that waiver of inadmissibility, it can forgive, you can ask USCIS to forgive pretty much anything except like Nazi persecution, genocide, torture, and extrajudicial killings, in theory, right? In practice, it's more of a case-by-case determination. So if you have a survivor that has a long criminal history, you're going to want to think about, what were the root causes, if they were connected to the abuse or the exploitation or the trafficking, then you can explain that, and you'll be able to, it's a little bit easier to get than a waiver of inadmissibility. So I wanted to go to look at.
Melody, sorry to interrupt you. I see hand raised by Hannah. I don't know if she has questions.
Okay.
Yes, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. So I actually have a situation where the US citizen married a non-documented person, but when they met, she was actually being trafficked. And that person was in danger to like file formal charges, but she used like service providers that qualified her under as being a trafficking victim. Would that qualify her now spouse for the U visa, or is that a different visa altogether?
So if she didn't report it to a law enforcement agency, then it's probably going to be difficult to obtain a certification, right? Which is necessary. But hold that thought, because there may be an option with the T visa, okay? And you'll find out why in a few moments. But I think for the U visa, she would have a hard time because there was no contact with law enforcement agency based on the factual scenario, I think that you told me.
Okay, and so with that, on that note, if it would cause her, they didn't have children together, but if it would cause her substantial psychological harm if he left, would that be able to qualify him for any type of anything?
So I am not sure of the factual scenario. I mean, it sounded like, from what I understood, she's married to a US citizen, right? But she was also exploited before that.
No, he's the US citizen. And is the undocumented
Okay, and
person.
you kind of broke up in there, so I'm not sure I heard it correctly.
The husband is the undocumented person.
Okay, the husband is the undocumented person. Okay, so who was the US citizen in this instance?
The person that was trafficked.
Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. Well then, I don't think he would qualify for the U visa or the T visa, because he was not a victim of the human trafficking. But is he being abused by the US citizen?
No, but his life was in danger because they were actually dating when she was being actively trafficked.
Yeah, I mean, then, I think it would be a factual scenario, but it would have to be very fact specific. Just straight away, it doesn't look like he would be eligible for anything. Obviously, and because also that was not reported to law enforcement, right? But if, let's say, he had reported it to law enforcement and had participated in the investigation and or in the detection and or investigation and or prosecution of the activity, then maybe he might be eligible for a U visa. And depending on what he had witnessed, he may qualify as a bystander witness victim. But it would be hard to say without going into like doing a more factual investigation, which kind of exceeds the scope of this particular presentation. But when in doubt, refer people for an annual immigration screening. The purpose of these presentations is not for you to do, right, the screening. It's more to be like, I know about these types of relief. It would be worth exploring. And sometimes the answer is no, you're not eligible, but you won't know unless you get screened. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah. So Swastika, can I have a time check?
It's 10:45. We do have half an hour
Perfect.
more.
Okay, great. So hold off your questions. I promise that I will answer them in a moment, but I just want to keep moving because we have a lot to learn. So I've been talking about these qualifying crimes, and so I've listed here all of the crimes. This is actually how they appear in the certification form, the I-918 Supplement B certification form. So you will see here they're listed by alphabetical order, but there are, they are like broad categories. So you will see like categories related to kidnapping and abduction, being held hostage, false imprisonment. You will see categories around exploitation, trafficking, involuntary servitude, slave trade, you will see categories around sexual assaults, abusive sexual contacts, sexual exploitation, rape, um, incest, etc. And you will also see categories around like blackmail, perjury, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, uh, etc. And so, and then uh, there's also the USCIS will also consider any attempt to commit any of the named crimes, and also any similar activities. So and they all must violate some law in the United States, whether it be local, state, or federal law. So if you have a survivor of domestic violence who was abused in her home country only, then that person's not going to qualify for a U visa. But if that person was abused in her home country and then, moved to the United States and then was abused by the same abuser again in the United States, she may qualify for a U visa. If the abuse was only in the home country, then that person might contemplate, filing an asylum case based on gender-based violence. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that many times, incidents of domestic violence actually may include other qualifying crimes. So, for example, I had a case where, like in San Francisco, where a woman was physically attacked and strangled. And I actually could not access the police report for that particular case due to some rules around confidentiality because the child had witnessed the abuse. So I prepared the certification request based on what was in her emergency protective order, and I cited, the penal code section for inflicting corporal injury on a spouse or cohabitant. And then when I got the certification back signed, the certifier had added false imprisonment and attempted homicide. And so this is all to say that, one incident of domestic violence, as we think of it, can actually be comprised of multiple qualifying criminal activities. So in her case, she had 3 qualifying criminal activities. And another one that we see frequently is in incidents of domestic violence, the survivors trying to call the police, but the abuser will take the phone and throw it and destroy it. And so that can be considered witness tampering. So that's another qualifying crime. And restraining order violations, we have categorized as domestic violence. And in any case, it would fit under any similar activity. Okay, so I've already talked about certifications. The importance of helpfulness is that the person has an ongoing duty of being helpful to reasonable requests from law enforcement in the detection, investigation, and prosecution of the crime. And that lasts through until a decision is made on their green card application. In California, also, California is one of the strongest immigrant rights states, believe it or not. And a few years ago, they passed the California Penal Code Section 679.10, which creates a rebuttable presumption of helpfulness if the victim reported it to the police. And it also establishes clear turnaround times for the law enforcement agency to review the certification request. So it's 30 days if someone is not in removal proceedings and 7 days if they are in removal proceedings. And that was critical because with so many law enforcement jurisdictions, you can imagine that there was a lot of disparity in whether or not law enforcement jurisdictions were signing the certifications, because we encountered, like, for example, law enforcement jurisdictions that were racist and didn't think that the U visa should have been created, even though because they didn't think that the people who aren't documented should have access to relief because they are here without documentation. And also some law enforcement jurisdictions would take forever to return certifications, or some would just refuse to sign them. And then I had already talked about certifying agencies. So quick scenario. So we have two scenarios here. And so I want to, the purpose of the scenario is to explore what is a qualifying criminal activity, okay, and for the purpose of the U visa. So in scenario one, Ricardo leaves his wallet in his car while he's at the store. Someone broke into his car, damaging a window and stealing his wallet, including his paycheck. Ricardo reported the incident to the police report. He feels anxious about making ends meet and is traumatized. And in scenario two, he is walking home. He's accosted by someone who points a gun at him and threatens to kill him. And if he does not hand over his wallet, so he turns over his wallet and his attacker flees. He makes a police report of the incident, and he has a recurring nightmare about the incident. So who thinks that scenario one applies? Who thinks scenario two applies? Yes, good. I like that. Yes, C only. Good. In scenario one, I mean, we're assuming that he doesn't have a relationship with his attacker, because if he had a relationship with his attacker, then scenario one, maybe, and if it fit under domestic violence, then maybe we could try to also see if it qualified him, because vandalism can be a crime of domestic violence if the parties have the requisite relationship. But here, just based on the facts that we know, he would not have been a victim of a certain qualifying crime, right? Breaking and entering in his car, vandalizing his car, if it's in a non-domestic violence scenario, is not a qualifying crime for the U visa, as opposed to scenario two, where it looks like a felonious assault because a gun is used and there are death threats. And so that would qualify for a U visa. Okay, so the benefits of the U visa are, and Swastika, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I actually have until 1:15 because we had made the presentations a little bit longer this year.
It is 11:15 on my calendar, so.
Okay, thank you. So what are the benefits? I talked about the broad waiver for inadmissibility issues, so it's a really, really good remedy in that sense. You get, if it's granted, then you get 4 years with a U visa, and you get an employment authorization, so a work permit. You can also apply for your social security card with once you have your work permit. You may actually be able to apply for your social security card before that, because there is, since the backlog is so long, USCIS has created a process by which they try to determine if your application was done in good faith and you've submitted like all the forms and the cert and the declaration, and they've run your background check and they don't think you're a threat to national security or the public safety. And then you can actually apply for a temporary work permit while waiting for the final adjudication for your U visa. And the application for the work permit also allows people to apply for their valid social security number and card now. You may include derivative beneficiaries. So that includes parents, spouses, children who are unmarried and under 21 years of age. For applicants who are under 21 years of age and are unmarried, they can also include siblings if there are unmarried and under 18 years of age. You can apply for a green card after 3 years of having the U visa. The people who were principal applicants at the U visa stage can also include certain qualifying family members when they are applying for their green card or after applying for their green card. So oftentimes we see after acquired spouses. And as soon as you apply for the U visa, you are eligible under state law for certain public benefits. So for survivors, that can be really useful. They may be eligible for CalWorks, CalFresh, Medi-Cal, CAPI if they're blind, disabled, or 65 years or older, etc. They are not eligible for federal benefits. Okay, so question: how may human trafficking and domestic violence intersect? Let me look at the chat.
Please feel free to put it on the chat and I can read it out loud for you.
Okay, maybe that's a tough question. Let me walk you all through it. So we have seen scenarios where abusers traffic their victim, right, their survivor. And this can be forcing them into prostitution, forcing them to do sexual exploitation, like in front of webcams. It can also be domestic servitude types of cases where they treat their spouse as an enslaved person, or force them to work in like restaurants or other types of businesses with no pay, no breaks, and the threat of violence if they don't comply. And then also, it's also known through research that survivors of domestic violence are at risk of further exploitation. And so we also see survivors of domestic violence being exploited, not by their abusers, but by others, because they're just more at risk of falling into exploitation. So these are some of the intersections. And feel free to add more in the chat if something if something pops up. In the
Melody,
Merry Christmas.
Yeah.
I can see a couple of responses here. One party in a relationship may traffic the other. And
Yeah.
Maria writes, abusive partners may set up their partner to be trafficked.
Yes, exactly. Yes, sometimes we see people who make false promises, right? They have like the honeymoon stage and they're like, oh, come here and I will support you and we'll be married and we'll build a life together. And then as soon as they land, they take away their papers and force them into sexual exploitation, for example. Okay, so I wanted to talk briefly about continued presence. And because it is a type of remedy that can be very useful when assisting a survivor of human trafficking. And human trafficking can include labor trafficking and sexual exploitation. But it is not something that the attorney will apply for on behalf of the victim. It's is something that a law enforcement agency who's authorized to investigate or prosecute the human trafficking can request through their local Homeland Security investigation field office. So it is the law enforcement agency that will fill out the forms and request this 2-year renewable work permit and temporary protection from removal, and to Homeland Security investigations, and they will process this request and issue the work permit. Attorneys can be useful in this process because oftentimes we're the ones who fill out the forms and then give them to the law enforcement agency to give to Homeland Security's investigations. But if you are dealing with a trafficking survivor who is involved in a prosecution, and let's say the district attorney has not applied for continued presence, you may want to link us, right, to link an immigration attorney to the district attorney to talk about this, because it can be very useful. One, they can get their work permits so they can get a job that's less exploitative, right? That's the goal. And also they're not a fear of being deported for at least 2 years, right? And it's renewable. And that can be very helpful in getting a job and getting stability while they wait for, let's say, their T visa to be adjudicated. Okay, so now we're gonna switch to T visas. And so the T visa is for survivors of severe forms of human trafficking who are here in the United States on account of the human trafficking. This doesn't mean that they have to have been trafficked into the United States. They could have entered the United States at any time, but that they are here physically present in the United States on account of the human trafficking. So that they have never left the United States because they're still suffering, from the trauma of the human trafficking, or they are still involved in the investigation or prosecution of the human trafficking. They have to show that they've complied with reasonable requests from law enforcement for the investigation or prosecution. And so it's best to show that they have attempted to make a report to law enforcement. It's also strongly encouraged to get a declaration from a law enforcement officer showing this compliance, but it's not necessary. So there's no need for certification like in the U visa context. And then there are exceptions to this compliance requirement. One, if you're dealing with a survivor of human trafficking who's under 18 years of age, you don't have to include that. Or if you're dealing with someone who has such severe trauma from the human trafficking that it would be aggravated if they were to try to report it to law enforcement. They also have to show that they will suffer extreme hardship involving severe and unusual harm if they were removed. And so that can be, you know, country conditions, like if they come from a country where there's a lot of civil unrest, or that they would, that their traffickers could find them and harm them, or that they would be unable to obtain or exercise their rights here in the United States if they were deported. So for example, if they had filed a wage and hour claim and then they were deported, they wouldn't be able to enforce right to their rights or continue, or let's say they wouldn't be able to be involved in the prosecution of the trafficking. And they also have to show that they're admissible or eligible for a waiver of inadmissibility. Unlike the U visa context, that waiver of inadmissibility is a little less broad, but it's pretty good in terms of if you can connect the inadmissibility issue with the human trafficking. So sometimes people are, you know, arrested for certain crimes like prostitution or other crimes that are related to the human trafficking. And or let's say someone is arrested for driving under the influence, and you can connect the use of alcohol as a way, as their way of trying to cope with the trauma of the human trafficking situation, then you may be able to get a waiver of inadmissibility. And so what does severe form of human trafficking means? It is defined under federal law. And so in general, you have these three columns, you know, the process, what procedures, what ways did the traffickers obtain the survivors and or maintain the survivors of human trafficking, the means, how they did that. So it could be by force, fraud, or coercion. And coercion can include like threats of misuse of the legal system. So threats of deportation, threats of, well, you'll be arrested and convicted and you'll be deported. And ends is for what purposes. So that includes labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And labor trafficking can be, you know, for doing work that's not paid, or indebting the survivor so much so that they are basically enslaved with no ability to pay off the debt. And then so normally you have to show at least one under each column, except for if you're dealing with a minor who's been induced into sexual exploitation. So if they're under 18 years of age and they're being sexually exploited, you don't have to show force, fraud, or coercion. I do want to just take a few seconds to talk about process. So recruiting, harboring means like if you kept people, so it could be keeping them, you know, in a shed or in a warehouse or in a house. Moving, it doesn't have to be across borders. It can be, you know, it doesn't have to be long distances. It can be like moving them from job site to job site. Obtaining, so how they obtain a person, providing a person to another person for the purpose of being trafficked. And in the commercial sexual exploitation context, it includes patronizing and soliciting a person for sex trafficking.
Melody, just a time check. We do have 5 more minutes.
Yeah, so I want to hold off questions, people, and so the benefits of the T visa, again, it has a general inadmissibility waiver, maybe a little less than a U visa. You get 4 years of non-immigrant status, like the U visa. You get a work permit. You also are eligible for a social security number card. You can include derivative beneficiaries. And here, if you can show, you may even be able to include adult children and adult parents if you can show that they are at risk because of the human trafficking. You can also apply for a green card, and you may be eligible to apply for a green card earlier than waiting those 3 years. If the criminal case is over and the survivor has reasonably complied, and in order to show that, you can get a letter from the Department of Justice. And you are eligible for public benefits like refugees. And so that includes not only state funded public benefits, but also federal benefits. So kind of like in the VAWA context. Okay, I'm gonna skip the hypo in just a second. I just wanted to show you what approval notices look like. So this is one for the U visa. This is a U visa and a passport for someone who was abroad. So a derivative was approved, but they were abroad, so they had to consular process. This is a T visa approval notice. These are work permits, and I've listed like the relevant categories. This is the green card. It's a green card, and I've listed the categories as well. And the I-485 approval notice. And I mentioned that I wanted to let y'all know how to refer people to our legal advice line. We have a dedicated legal advice line for survivors of interpersonal violence. Please make sure that you do not give this out to you know, anyone other than survivors of interpersonal violence. We do have a general legal advice line as well. We also have a health consumer center that can answer any questions on health access, health insurance, you know, whether or not a service is covered by a health insurance program, and basically anything related to health access questions. And also, you know, if you are working with a survivor, I would say it's best to connect them first to the Family Justice Center. We do get referrals made through the Family Justice Center, but the beauty of the Family Justice Center and the navigators is that they can work with the survivor to address both their legal and non-legal needs and connect them to the relevant agencies without having the survivor repeat necessarily the whole story, or having to travel from agency to agency. And then finally, we do have domestic violence restraining order clinics by appointments that are made by stand. And so I believe the number is still 1-888-55-55-5555. I may have said an extra 5 for stand. And then, yeah, I guess for questions, I'm open to questions. And, you know, my question is, what's one thing that you learned today?
We do have one question here in the chat, and I have I saw Chelsea Brandon's hand was raised before. Chelsea,
Okay.
do you have a question? You can go ahead and ask her. Chelsea, are you still there? Let's take next.
I'll take Maria's question. This is a really good question. And then, I will also, so the child abuse prevention question, who pays for the legal assistance you recommend? If someone is eligible for our services and they meet the income and financial eligibility requirements, they don't pay. And then there are other trustworthy organizations like Catholic Charities for the East Bay, Immigration Institute for the Bay Area, that depending on their grant situation, they may be able to provide the services for free or at a sliding scale. But again, I think that's also why you would want to connect a survivor to the Family Justice Center. Maria Campos says, let's say a person applies for the U visa and does not get accepted for the U visa. Will they be at risk now that they have put their illegal status out there? This is a big reason why I have seen survivors not want to move forward with a U visa, because they fear that they may not be accepted and now they are put out there. Yes, okay, that is an excellent question. And it is a complex question. Under the Trump administration, you know, in November of 2018, Trump issued a policy that basically said, you know, anyone who's denied in a humanitarian application, including U visas, is at risk of having a notice to appear, which is the charging document that initiates removal proceedings or deportation proceedings. Biden has adopted a victim-centered approach, but I will say that there is always a risk of removal. But that's also why it's really important to have a screening by an experienced immigration attorney that specializes in U visas and T visas. A lot of the times, you know, our clients have a history of immigration violations, and those tend to be okay. Like, we can get waivers of inadmissibility. If they have a history of arrest, we see a lot of survivors, for example, arrested by error for domestic violence. And so we're able to explain that. Biden has really striven to adopt a more victim-centered approach, supposedly. And I think this administration is just more victim-centered and more aware of these issues. But we most of our cases, you know, most of our cases involve waivers of inadmissibility, and they're usually granted. I will say that I had, you know, a denial for a U visa, but that was because I had inherited the case, and the client had I did not know this, but the client had been already convicted of several drug offenses and child endangerment, without consulting her previous Bay legal attorney or me. And I didn't find out about it until we got a request for evidence from USCIS about that. And we helped her connect to a private attorney for her removal defense. But that was the only one, that's the only case where there's been an outright denial. And then they did try to start deportation proceedings. But I would say, you know, the U visa, again, is one of those remedies that has a broad waiver of inadmissibility. And we tell clients, you know, it's really important to let us know if you've been arrested, cited, charged, convicted, not because we want to judge you, that's not the point, but we want to make sure that we know the facts so that we can, you know, give you the best advice that we can. And we often ask that people do an FBI records request and a live scan so that we can see what pops up, right, in the state system and also in the federal system in their background.
Melody, we do have one more question here. Jennifer Teve said, I have a question. Jennifer, can you unmute yourself and ask a question? This would be the last
Go
question
ahead,
for today.
Yes, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So my client, she came from Haiti, and she got her work permit, her temporary work permit. She was given like a temporary social Now I'm not sure if she applied for the U visa and that was what was denied, or if it was for her green card. So that's what I don't know off the top of my head. But she had applied and was denied, and then she, because of not being able to be, like they couldn't verify the information that she was putting for the reason why she was applying for the U visa from her country. And so it got denied, and then she put in another appeal, and now she's in the process of her last appeal for this. But because of the previous administration, she was told that she can no longer work now that her appeal was denied, and that the previous administration did that intentionally to be cruel, so that individuals fleeing would have to leave since there's no option for work. Has there been any conversation about that being changed for individuals that are awaiting their last appeal decision, or that still remains?
You know, I think there's some facts that are not clear from that scenario. From what I could gather, so she's from Haiti, you said originally?
Yes. Or I'm
So
sorry.
my
Yeah.
best guess is that she obtained temporary protected status because Haiti is designed as a country. And she probably tried to apply for a green card because I think it would have taken much longer for her to apply for a U visa. Like she would still be waiting for a decision. But because immigration attorneys were using like a loophole to try to get people to apply for their green card. Unfortunately, under the last administration, there was a case that was issued, and I believe also that went all the way to the Supreme Court, that basically made it impossible for people to apply for a green card based on temporary protected status. And I believe that also under the Trump administration, at some point, the designation for Haiti as a for temporary protective status was ended. I know that the Biden administration I believe they have redesignated Haiti for temporary protective status. So I'm not sure that it was like conditional on her appeal per se, on the denial of her appeal. Obviously, when you're appealing, if your work permit is still valid, it will be valid, right? Until it expires. But I think she would have had to file like renewal paperwork for the temporary protected status. But she may have been affected by the end of that designation of Haiti. So I think that's actually what probably happened, but obviously that is why, again, the immigration law is so complicated, because it also changes all the time. And particularly under the Trump administration, you know, the Trump administration did like over 400 distinct like actions, whether it was like through rules or through policies or through even informal policies. Like they started denying U visa applications if you left a field blank, even if it wasn't applicable to your client, or even if, say, someone didn't have a middle name, you still had to write like N/A, and if you didn't, they would reject the application. They really did that as a way of, you know, creating kind of like the invisible wall, right? That they were, it was like the manifestation of the wall that they wanted to create physically at the borders, but it was, there was a separate invisible wall to deter people from filing, and also to make people like self-deport, basically.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really informative. I appreciate it.
Thank you
Yes.
so much, Melody. We are a little bit out of time, so these are the questions that we had.
There is one question: how often do you encounter shame from the victims you serve, making them less than forthcoming? You know, it's going to take time, right? I mean, I think it takes a special skill to be an advocate. to be an attorney, to be anyone who's working with survivors, because you're basically asking them to say very personal, traumatic, intimate details of their lives, like pretty much right away. So I think, you know, I encounter a lot of emotions coming from different survivors. There's not one uniform response to trauma, and and part of the skill is to adapt, but also build that trust. And I think, you know, I have been successful in by explaining why, by explaining that I'm not there to judge. I'm really here to explain, and part of it is going to be me really listening to their story, and asking specific questions, and that also making it, you know, like it may require multiple interviews. It may not, it may require multiple meetings. You know, we had a client who came in for a consult for a U visa, and a law clerk, and she was being interviewed by a colleague of mine, and the law clerk saw, I don't know, she noticed some hesitation, right? And so she came to me because I was her supervisor, and she said, I think this person is hiding something, like it's not being forthcoming. And you're really good at getting the facts out. And there was also maybe like using the interpreter was like, was a little tough. And so I asked my colleague if she would be comfortable if I just came in and asked some questions, because I spoke the language that the survivor spoke. And my colleague understood and was like, yeah, sure. And so, you know, I went in there and I said, you know, it's, we need to know the good facts and we need to know the bad facts. And, you know, what you may think is a bad fact, actually, we can help overcome them, you know, and we're not here to judge, but we won't be able to give you the advice that you need if we don't know everything. And so is there anything that, you know, is weighing on your mind that you would like to share? And remember, this is confidential. We're not sharing it with anyone else. We're not going to file anything without your consent. And so it came to light that, you know, she had been trafficked both sexually, and that her traffickers, you know, had both sexually and labor trafficking, and that she was scared because the traffickers had threatened her child, etc. And so I think the other part that I like to use is grounding skills at, or you know, at the end of an interview. I give like options like doing exercises or meditations, and I ask my clients, you know, what is one thing that you're going to do for yourself today, at the end, so that they don't leave with their minds still like, you know, stuck in the trauma, but rather that they're back in the present and realize that they're safe. And I think that that helps them with whatever shame they may feel, but also hopefully helps empower them. So I hope, I mean, Child Abuse Prevention Council, I hope that answers your questions. I don't know your name, so.
Thank you so much, Melody.
Melody, you did answer my question, all three of them actually, throughout this presentation. And thank you, great presentation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Melody, and thank you everyone for being present and being participatory in this presentation. This was a very great information for every one of us. I do have put both the STAN and Family Justice Center number. If anything comes across, you can call us and then let us know how we can go from there to help a client. Thank you, everyone. Happy Friday. Thank you, Melody.
Thank you so much, and take good care, everyone.